This is Pearl Harbor. This is where the Pacific War began in World War II. The USS Arizona was bombed and sank during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The wreck still lies at the bottom of the sea. The USS Missouri, now a memorial ship in the harbor, fought in the late stages of World War II, witnessing the war's end.
The purpose of this plaque, this location, is where the surrender table was located on September 2nd, 1945 in Tokyo Bay. And this is where the Allies accepted the formal surrender from the Empire of Japan. So this is the centerpiece of the surrender deck. The entire surrender deck is where we're standing right here.
70 years ago, Xu Yongchang, Chief of Military Operations, and the Republic of China representative at the Japanese surrender ceremony signed the instrument of surrender. After the ceremony, each representative of the Allied powers received a copy of the instrument. The copy that went to General Xu and the pen he used to sign the instrument are in the collection of Academia Historica. These artifacts testify to the Allies' recognition of the Republic of China's major contribution in the victory over Japan.
Well, I think there are a number of reasons why eventually the Allied powers won. But I think on the Chinese side it was several things. One was perseverance. Perseverance of the leadership, perseverance of the troops, the bravery of the troops, but also the perseverance of the Chinese people.
我15岁去参军，主要是中国民族的危亡。抗日的决心呢，是大家一样的，一条心，一点都没有错。
在那个情况之下，里面都也兴起了一个救亡运动。在这种情况之下，我特别忠群的，同胞们起来，看那800壮士做榜样。 中国不违法，中国不违法。
你看那800壮士国军奔走东战场。
8年抗战呢，这个仗没有白打，这是中华民族的胜利，是全中国人的胜利，我为此感到骄傲。
在从未中游荡。
With the surrender of Germany on May 8, 1945, the alliance of the Axis powers was dissolved. On July 26th, U.S. President Harry S. Truman, President of the National Government of the Republic of China Chiang Kai-shek, and Prime Minister of Great Britain Winston Churchill issued the Potsdam Declaration, which outlined the terms of Japan's unconditional surrender as previously announced in the Cairo Declaration. Japan had initially rejected the terms of surrender. However, in early August, after the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the US and the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan, the escalating military pressure forced Emperor Hirohito to call for a midnight cabinet meeting on August 10th, where he sanctioned his council to accept the terms of surrender. While initial negotiations between Japan and the Allies were highly confidential, word of Japan's surrender spread on the night of August 10th.
我在昆明，在美军参谋指挥学校学习。8月10号晚上，我们正在看美国电影，这是美军呢塞班岛之战，看得真热闹的时候，我们那个校长马丁少将。 还有一个教授，停，不要放了，我们就不懂啊，什么一回事啊？他讲告诉你们很好的消息，特大喜讯，啊，你们中国打了8年，我们美国也打了4年，啊，日本鬼子投降了，我们这个美军无线电呢？ 已经收到电文了，那是用密码的，不是用密码的，所以他向我们宣布。
radioman got messages first, so we knew pretty much what was happening. Interesting, I was asleep at the time, so a friend of mine, the radioman, came up and woke me up and said the Japanese have accepted our surrender terms, so it appears that the war is over. But don't tell anyone. It's going to be announced. Well, of course, everyone knew about it within 5 minutes.
According to the diaries of Chiang Kai-shek, at around 8 in the evening, cheers and firecrackers were heard at the U.S. military headquarters in Chongqing, located near Jiang's official residence. Jiang, who was at his evening prayers, heard the noise and sent his adjutant to learn what had happened. The adjutant later reported that it's said that our enemy has surrendered. Shortly afterwards, an official message of Japan's surrender arrived when Jiang was having dinner with the Mexican ambassador. Jiang quickly finished the banquet and convened a meeting with senior military officers. The emergency meeting lasted until midnight.
其实日本要投降这样一个信息，在8月初左右，将已经获得一些所谓信息，只是不知道是哪一天而已。所以8月10号所听到的，只是意料中的意外而已。
Cabinet meeting with President Truman studied Japan's surrender messages.
On August 11th, the U.S. representative replied on behalf of the governments of the U.S., UK, Soviet Union, and China accepting Japan's surrender. 3 days later, Japan officially notified Washington, D.C. that Emperor Hirohito had issued the imperial rescript on the termination of the war, and that the Japanese government accepted the Potsdam Declaration.
General Douglas MacArthur has been appointed the Supreme Allied Commander to receive the Japanese surrender. Great Britain, Russia, and China will be represented by high-ranking officers. Meantime,
on August 14th at 7 p.m. in Washington, 7 a.m. on the 15th in Chongqing, news of Japan's surrender was announced simultaneously in the capitals of the U.S., UK, Soviet Union, and China. With the war finally over, public revelry and massive celebrations swept through every corner of the Allies' territories.
听了广播，日本投降了，大家就在那里叫中华民国万岁啊！把帽子扔在天上去了，云香，旷野的云香，高兴死了，胜利了，好回家了。
从此以后没有转变了，当兵的人也可以退伍了，啊，回到自己的家里去了，这个难道不高兴吗？当然是挺高兴的。
防护的衣服啊就可以脱掉了，这个枪弹都可以卸下来了，可以休息了，就不要再打了。
全国军民同胞们，全世界爱好和平的人士们，今天我们是胜利了。
At 10 a.m. August 15th, Chiang Kai-shek, president of the national government, made a nationwide victory broadcast.
我们人野区的同胞们，受尽了无用惨灾和懦弱的黑暗，今天是达到了完全解放而重见青天白日了。今天敌军已被我们盟邦共同打倒了，我们当然要严密抓紧他忠实尽所有的投降条件。这我们并不要报复，更不可对敌国无辜人民加以侮辱。
蒋介石先生他在抗战胜利以后，这个发表了这个不念旧恶，以德报怨啊这样子的一篇这个文稿。从一个历史的一个角度来看，其实它最重要的一个功能就是消弭了啊这个仇恨的一种复制。
从讲个人的日记还有各方面的立场来看的话，他也切实认为说不要跟日本的人民为敌，因为基本上广大的日本人民是无辜的。
日本人にとっても蒋介石に対して蒋介石が日本これまでの侵略戦争をこれは一部の軍閥がやって日本の人民は関係ないといったことに対して非常にやっぱり彼ら日本の人たちは感謝をするようになったと思う。
Just as Chiang Kai-shek mentioned in the broadcast, which he drafted personally, after the victory, the Allied powers immediately faced the monumental task of facilitating Japan's surrender. In a letter to Chiang on August 12th, Truman proposed to appoint Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, to arrange for the acceptance of Japan's surrender. Chiang later wrote on the translated telegram, "Send another telegram to General MacArthur to inform him I've appointed General Xu Yongchang, Chief of Military Operations, as representative of Chinese forces." Xu was placed in charge of military operations, intelligence, strategy and tactics, and personnel administration. At 6:50 p.m. on August 17th, Xu Yongchang and his deputy boarded an American plane that departed from Chongqing. They arrived at Manila at midnight on August 18th. At 5:30 in the afternoon, Xu first met with MacArthur. On August 19th, Richard K. Sutherland, MacArthur's chief of staff, met with the Japanese delegate Toroshiro Kawabe to arrange for the scheduled surrender ceremony in Japan. At 5 p.m. on August 26th, Xu Yongchang and representatives from other Allied powers boarded a northbound American carrier. They arrived at the Bay of Yokohama at 4:40 p.m. on August 31st. Just one day earlier, MacArthur arrived at Atsugi Airfield near Tokyo on his personal aircraft. The U.S. Third Fleet, its flagship being the USS Missouri, also arrived at Tokyo Bay to prepare for the surrender ceremony.
It was a decision made, basically to have the Japanese surrender delegation come out to us. Now, we had already started occupying military bases around Tokyo and Yokohama. And also, the Allied fleet had assembled in Tokyo Bay. So we were already occupying the area. Somewhat symbolic as well, surrendering on our sovereign territory.
One thing I failed to mention, and I'll show you. Those of us that were aboard the ship at the time of the surrender were all given a card.
That was on board the ship received a special card with a Japanese Rising Sun flag and signatures of all the senior officers and the commanding officer, and only representatives that were physically on board received a card.
At 8:15 a.m. on September 2nd, Tokyo time, Xu Yongchang and other representatives boarded the USS Missouri. Fleet officers and reporters from around the world had gathered to witness this historic moment.
Interestingly, American officers were in working uniform, khakis, no tie, open collar. Primarily, I think it was to not make it a big dignified, because the Japanese came aboard in cutaways, and they were very, very proper and formal in it. And MacArthur was sort of against that, and everybody was in khakis with no tie. Now, we were in whites, the crew. And the crew, if you were being able to watch it, were hanging all over the superstructure of the ship.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. As Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, I announce it my firm purpose, in the tradition of the countries I represent, to proceed in the discharge of my responsibilities with justice and tolerance, while taking all necessary dispositions to ensure that the terms of surrender are fully, promptly, and faithfully complied with.
After MacArthur finished his speech, at 9:04, Mamoru Shigemitsu and Yoshijiro Umezu, representing the Japanese government and armed forces respectively, signed the instrument. At 9:08, representatives of the Allied powers signed the instrument.
For China, General Xu Yongchang.
Xu Yongchang was the third to sign, after MacArthur and Nimitz. At 9:15, after all the representatives had signed the instrument in duplicate, MacArthur led them out. Chief of Staff Sutherland presented one of the duplicates to the Japanese delegation. At 9:25, the ceremony officially concluded. A formation of Allied aircraft flew over the USS Missouri to mark the victory of the Allies in World War II and the beginning of the Allied occupation of Japan.
The United States occupied the country because Japan had been their enemy, and the U.S. was determined to disarm the country. I mean, Japan still had 1 million or so soldiers in Japan, but also mostly on the mainland in China, Manchuria, and so on. So the first thing that Americans wanted to make sure was that Japan would be disarmed.
The instrument of surrender clearly states that the authority of the emperor and the Japanese government to rule the state shall be subject to the supreme commander for the Allied powers. Under MacArthur's command, Japanese forces at other remaining holdings of Asia and the Pacific surrendered to the respective Allied powers. The Republic of China was about to receive a more realistic victory and surrender. Before World War II ended, the Allies had planned to divide Japan into 4 occupation zones, each under the administration of the US, UK, Soviet Union, and China, as was done in Allied-occupied Germany and Austria. However, when Japan surrendered, the US had insisted on taking over Japan alone. MacArthur established the general headquarters for SCAP in Tokyo, and from there supervised the occupation. General Order No. 1 was MacArthur's first order to the Japanese forces then encamped outside of Japan. The order instructed them to surrender to designated Allied commanders. Based on the first article of the order, all Japanese armed forces within China, excluding Manchuria, Formosa or Taiwan, and French Indochina north of 16 degrees north should surrender to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek.
抗战胜利以后，讲的对于整个日本的一些工作的话，大概可以分为受降、接收、复原这3个步骤。
要接收啊，它面临到这个交通设施啊，这个条件的这些种种的不足，它没有办法在第一时间到前方去这个上海啊、南京啊、北平这些城市去执行接收，因为当时这个部队啊还在中国的西南西北。 所以就必须要靠这个盟国啊，尤其是美军啊的这个飞机跟这个船舰，
整个的中国战区的受降还需要跟盟军合起来，就是做一个大的战略。然后受降的时候就会涉及到地盘、物资、军械、人员的安排，所以这是蒋介石应该是花心思最多的。
Chiang Kai-shek appointed He Ying-chin, Commander-in-Chief of the Chinese Army, to oversee the Japanese surrender in the China theater. On August 15, 1945, Jiang issued a telegram to Yasuji Okamura, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Army, laying out 6 terms of surrender. The terms specified the Japanese forces should cease all military operations, maintain strict order and traffic in their current location, and wait for further notice from He Ying-chin. Between August 17th and 18th, telegrams were exchanged between China and Japan concerning the negotiations of surrender. It was decided the negotiations would take place in Zhejiang in Hunan. At 5 p.m. on August 20th, He flew from Chongqing to Zhejiang with members of the Army headquarters to oversee the negotiations.
美国军方给芷江这个空军基地冠了一个特殊的名称，叫万人之王。有当时盟军在华的第2大机场，驻有中美飞机400多架，国军驻扎有20多万。芷江是处于前方的后方，后方的前方，介于陪都重庆和整个大华北中间，它是一个临界点，而且为受降提供了安全，再一个提供了交通的便利。
当时呢，这个安排在芷江，就是因为比较接近于双方便于去的地方，因为那个地方呢，不能找一个很大的地方，是当时双方还有敌意，就是互相要，虽然说是洽降，但是谈成谈不成，谁也不知道是什么样的结果。
17号，我就收到辽相电报，要我紧急坐飞机回到芷江，在芷江机场上，我们搭了一个帐篷，让他住在那里。我们警卫森严，50米一个兵，有宪兵，还有新留队的兵。
Escorted by Allied aircraft, the Japanese delegation, led by Takeo Imai, arrived at Zhejiang Airport at 11 a.m. on August 21st. The surroundings of the airport runways were already packed with Allied officers and soldiers. After arrival, the Japanese delegation was escorted by officers of the new 6th Army in a jeep and headed for Chilichao, a village east of Zhejiang, where the negotiations would take place. Here is where the surrender negotiations proceeded. Today, the local government has designated the place as a memorial park. In the park, to commemorate the event, a monumental archway was built. He's old office, the Army headquarters building, and the Hall for Surrender are also well maintained and convey a sense of solemnity. Staff members at the Memorial Park explained that the objects in the Hall for Surrender, including desks, chairs, and sofas, are all in the same place as when the negotiations took place. Historic photos and witnesses testify to the ecstasy that permeated the streets of Zhejiang on this particular day when Takeo Imai arrived.
8月21号这天是芷江啊，那是人山人海啊，就像过节一样的，就胜利的日子嘛。
这一个美国大兵叫约瑟夫·德，当年是在美国驻芷江的通讯兵。8月21号这一天，他拍了大量反映日本投降的彩色照片，全程每家每户悬挂了国旗，而且在主要的街道扎上了牌楼，比如说在丰裕桥这个地方扎上了正义大道，在南白大街上面建了一座正义之塔，而且在这个芷江的东门做了一个特殊的布置，有一副对联：庆5000年未有之胜利，开10000世永久之和平。而且在这个牌楼的中间有一个党徽，在党徽的上面有一排非常醒目的字：庆祝受降签字典礼。
At this very place, at 3 p.m. on August 21st, Xiao Yisu, Chief of Staff of the Chinese Army, was accompanied by Leng Xin, his deputy, and Hayden L. Boatner, U.S. Chief of Staff of the Chinese Combat Command. They met with Takeo Imai and received full information on the deployment of Japanese forces in China. Afterwards, Xiao read out the full text of Memorandum Zhongzi No. 1 and handed the memorandum to Imai, which would later be transmitted to Yasuji Okamura. Imai read the memorandum in detail, confirmed the terms, then signed the certificate of receiving memorandum at 4:40. Memorandum Zhongzi No. 1 was the first order issued by He Ying-chin to Yasuji Okamura before the official surrender instrument was signed. It contained measures to effectuate the surrender of Japanese forces in China. Here are some highlights. First, all Japanese forces within the China theater, as well as Taiwan and French Indochina, should surrender to designated Chinese commanders overseen by Yasuji Okamura. Second, Japanese forces must not surrender to commanders not designated by Chiang Kai-shek or He Ying-chin. Third, General Leng Xin would set up an advanced command post in Nanjing to supervise and make sure the orders are duly executed by Japanese forces. Takeo Imai and the Japanese delegation were detained in Zhejiang for 2 days for further questioning. On the morning of August 23rd, Memorandum Zhongzi No. 2 to No. 5 were delivered to Imai. He was also informed that the official surrender ceremony would take place in Nanjing. At 11:30 a.m., He Ying-chin summoned Imai and informed him that the Chinese armies scheduled to arrive at Nanjing would depart no later than August 30th. Imai was to convey this message to Yasuji Okamura, and due preparation should be made. At 1 p.m., Imai returned to Nanjing via the same plane, thus concluded the Zhejiang surrender negotiations.
芷江这个地方就确定了南京受降的所有的议程和规矩。
正式投降就需要一个最重要的场合、最庄重的场合。南京是原来国民政府的首都，孙中山先生临行所在，而且呢，侵华日军的总司令部也在这个地方，所以这个地方是最合适的一个地方，就标志着中国胜利。
At 9 a.m. on August 27th, Leng Xin led over 100 military officers from Zhejiang to Nanjing on 7 aircraft. They would be stationed in the advanced command post there. Wang Chuying, a member of this special team, recounted the moments when their planes arrived in Nanjing.
老百姓看到飞机来了，青天白日的那个标志，过去都是日本人红爸爸，现在是青天白日，都高兴，啊。 帽子向天上摔，我跟他们讲的第一句话：“对不起你们，我们来迟了。”这句话讲，我眼泪都下来了。的确的，就像报答自己的兄弟、父母一样的，对那个骨肉之情啊、同胞之谊啊，一下都流了出来了。我最感动的就这一个时刻。
The surrender ceremony in Nanjing was one of many such occasions after Japan's surrender. On August 23rd, Chiang Kai-shek instructed He Ying-chin that the official surrender by the Japanese representative Yasuji Okamura had to wait until the Japanese instrument of surrender was signed in Tokyo Bay, and Chinese armies were transported to Nanjing and Shanghai. Following Jiang's orders, on August 24th, He ordered Gu Zhutong, commander of the Third War Area, to march to Nanjing and Shanghai to take over airports and train stations. On the same day, more than 200 Chinese paratroopers and U.S. soldiers arrived at Nanjing Airport. Amid busy preparations for the Japanese surrender, a political confrontation concerning the surrender was emerging. Shortly after Japan announced its surrender, Juda, commander-in-chief of the Communist Army, ordered his troops to launch attacks on the collaborationist Chinese army and accept Japanese surrender on behalf of the Yan'an headquarters, rejecting Chiang Kai-shek's order not to move.
他们认为共军也参与了这个对日的抗战，也有资格接受日本的投降。你今天别的部队都接收日本投降，只有共军你叫他这个驻扎原地啊，然后不准行动。 那他们认为这个是这个对共军的一种这个歧视，那也是别有用心。国共双方都在竞赛，啊，做什么竞赛呢？就是接收竞赛。
中共的那个当时，因为他是个在野党，他的目标很明确，就是我要把地盘搞大一点，军队搞大一点，之后无论是打内战也好，谈判也好，我手上筹码多。那不像蒋先生，他要考虑他是执政党，他考虑要面子、国际观瞻，然后再利益均衡，所以这是两个最大的区别。
Amid the high tensions of an imminent civil war, Chiang Kai-shek had thrice telegraphed Mao Zedong, chairman of the Communist Party, and invited him to Chongqing for peace negotiations. Coordinated by the U.S. Ambassador Patrick J. Hurley, Mao flew from Yan'an to Chongqing on August 28th. That evening, he met with Jiang, and the two parties embarked on a series of peace negotiations that would last over a month. During this period, the signing of the Japanese Instrument of Surrender took place on September 2nd. For the following 3 days, the flags of the Republic of China and other Allied powers were displayed throughout the country to commemorate victory in the war as part of the national government's celebrations for the occasion. At 8:30 a.m. on September 3rd, the national government paid tribute to Dr. Sun Yat-sen's mausoleum in Nanjing. At 9 o'clock, the all-clear signal of the civil defense siren was heard for 10 minutes. It was called the Sound of Peace and followed by a 101-gun salute. At 10 o'clock, Jiang opened the grand celebration with an official proclamation. At 11:30, Jiang set out from the Military Affairs Commission to review the victory parade. Seeing the ecstatic crowds and exuberant celebrations, he later wrote in his diary, "Thinking of the 30 years of persistence and struggle, I finally feel slightly comforted seeing the celebration today." The next evening, a victory banquet was held in the auditorium of the Military Affairs Commission. Chiang Kai-shek toasted representatives of the Allies. Mao Zedong, who was invited to the banquet, also paid tribute to Jiang. This was perhaps the moment when the two finally put aside political disagreements and rejoiced in the long-awaited victory. On the other hand, in order to commemorate this historically significant day, the following year, the national government proclaimed September 3rd as the Victory over Japan Day. In 1955, it was changed to Armed Forces Day in honor of the military forces that won the final victory for this country. To this day, on Armed Forces Day, the government hosts an annual memorial ceremony in commemoration of the country's martyrs. As the celebrations gradually subsided, the new Sixth Army began to depart from Zhejiang to Nanjing on September 5th. On September 6th, Xiao Yisu and the delegation arrived in Nanjing to arrange for the surrender. At 8 a.m. on September 8th, He Yingqin boarded Meiling, the commander's plane for Madame Chiang Kai-shek, and departed from Zhejiang. He arrived at Nanjing at 12:15. Upon arrival, He was greeted with flowers by the representative of Nanjing citizens. He headed for the Army Headquarters Advanced Command, located inside the original site of the Central Military Academy, greeted by enthusiastic crowds along the way. At 3:20 p.m., He announced in the press conference that the formal surrender ceremony in the China Theater and the signing of the Act of Surrender would take place the next day. After 8 years of calamity and perseverance, the war was finally coming to a victorious end. In Nanjing, Huangpu Road was once renamed Jiefang Road in 1949 when the People's Republic of China was established. It was many years later that it was restored to its original name. On the morning of September 9, 1945, on this Huangpu Road, large numbers of vigilant military police and new Sixth Army officers gathered. On the road that led from the outer gate to the auditorium were flags of the Allied powers for every 10 steps. Fully armed soldiers stood between the flags, looking solemn and indomitable. Major Wang Chuying, a member of the new Sixth Army in Nanjing, took part in the preparation and vigilance work on this day.
我们调了一个工兵营，这工兵营干什么呢？扎牌坊、清理道路、竖旗帜。会场里面、外面的布置，沿头他也用烧垒器，每天都要去烧的。工兵扫雷啊。
At 8:30 a.m., Chinese Army officers and Allied officers who were there to attend the ceremony began to enter the auditorium. At 8:52, Japanese Representative Yasuji Okamura and members of the delegation arrived at the auditorium and were escorted to a separate room to wait for commencement of the ceremony. At 8:56, He Yingqin, representing the Allied powers in the China theater, led the other 4 officers into the auditorium. Chief of Staff Xiao Yisu, General Gu Zhutong of the Army, Admiral Chen Shaoquan of the Navy, and Colonel Jiang Tingmeng of the Air Force. As they entered, the audience all stood up to show respect. After they were seated, at 8:58, Yasuji Okamura and the Japanese delegation entered the auditorium. Arriving at their designated places, they bowed to He accordingly. He ordered them to take their seats. At 9 o'clock, He announced the opening of the ceremony. The first 5 minutes were reserved for photo-taking. After this, He instructed Okamura to submit his identity document. Upon confirmation, He instructed Xiao Yisu to hand the 2 duplicates of the Act of Surrender to Okamura. Okamura signed the duplicates, then handed them to Sasaburo Kobayashi, Chief of Staff for the China Expeditionary Army. Then Kobayashi, holding the Act of Surrender, walked to the table of the Chinese delegates. He handed the Act of Surrender to He Yingqin, an unforgettable historic moment captured by the camera.
签字仪式，一个是受降的，一个投降的。这个事情呢，在中华民族历史上是一个伟大的光辉礼仪。
He inspected the 2 duplicates of the act and signed them. He then returned 1 duplicate to Okamura. Then, He handed Order Number 1 of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and the certificate of receiving order to Okamura. Okamura duly signed and returned the certificate to the Chinese delegation. After the proceedings, He ordered the Japanese delegation to leave the venue. Then he announced that the signing of the Act of Surrender was complete. The audience cheered with enthusiastic applause, and the delegates of the Allies congratulated the Chinese representatives. Afterwards, attendants gradually left. The ceremony had lasted about 20 minutes. That afternoon, by He's order, General Leng Xin flew to Chongqing. The next morning, he attended the memorial ceremony in honor of the Guangzhou uprising led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, and submitted the Act of Surrender and the certificate, both signed by Okamura, to Chiang Kai-shek. On the same day, He was accompanied by Robert B. McClure, commander of the U.S.'s Chinese Combat Command, to a meeting with the Japanese delegates, including Okamura, in Nanjing. He once again made it clear that all Japanese forces should follow the orders of designated Chinese commanders and not the Japanese government. He also issued Order Junzi No. 1, based on which Okamura was named head of Post-War Rehabilitation Center for Japanese forces in the China theater, and would cooperate with the Chinese government to facilitate rehabilitation tasks. To make sure Japanese surrender in different areas would go smoothly, He had sent a memorandum to Okamura listing the names of Chinese commanders, war areas corresponding to Japanese military designations, and the names of respective commanders. The memorandum provided detailed regulations to be followed by Japanese forces during the surrender, such as protecting road communications, assembling at designated locations, and maintaining order in their current areas before the Chinese army took over command. The memorandum also regulated the manner in which Japanese forces were to make contact with the Chinese army and procedures for turning over arms and defense equipment. It was indeed very detailed and elaborate.
岡村も今井も日本政府および日本の東京の大本営の命令に従って降伏条件に従うと。特に国民政府側の出した要求に非常に忠実に従ったと思いますね。
这个时候是日本完全没有什么话语权的，应该是完全是中国方面自己决定，就中国接下来，然后就是知会你，我什么人到哪里去，你配合就好了。基本的就是程序，枪堆在这里，然后人站在那里，然后这个中国军队过来接收他们这个就解除武装之后，然后再怎么样，然后再怎么安排把他们集中起来，然后最后遣返回去。
アメリカのやっぱり船がね、日本の兵士たちを運んでますし、引き上げのあれでもアメリカがやっぱ協力してますよ。
中国又没有船，所以还是靠整个的盟军安排，所以这个周期蛮长的。除了这个军队之外，还大量的因为日本当时在东北大量的移民，然后比如在南京大量的另外一些非战斗人员。
It was estimated there were about 1.3 million Japanese troops and hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians within the China theater. As the Japanese civilians waited for repatriation, they were ordered to wear identification badges and stay in designated places for administrative purposes. Food supply was never cut off.
Somehow you had to feed them and concentrate them and then get them to Japan, and that would take months to complete.
This was October 10th. The surrender ceremony was held in the Hall of Supreme Harmony in the Forbidden City in Beijing. The number of guests attending this ceremony was the highest among all in the China theater. During the 4 months from the Zhejiang negotiations on August 23rd to the last surrender in Jinan on December 27th, Chinese Army forces arrived at major military locations as designated by the war areas and completed the takeover of previously occupied areas as instructed by Army headquarters. How many surrender ceremonies were held during this period? It was generally believed that only one such ceremony took place in each of the 16 war areas designated by the Memorandum Zhongzi No. 1, issued by Army headquarters to the Japanese. However, historical photos indicate surrender ceremonies also took place in minor places of the major war areas, such as Nantong City in Jiangsu Province. In such cases, proceedings in the official ceremonies were duly followed, including inspection of the Japanese representative's identification document, reading of the order by the Chinese commander, signing of the certificate, or even public address by the local representative. In general, Japanese surrender in different war areas in the China theater only varied in the participants, location, date, and scale, while other aspects such as procedures, arrangements, paperwork, and text of the certificate were exactly the same. By the decree of the national government, these historical records were collected into volumes and submitted as reports to the central government. Most of the records are now in the Academia Historica's collection and are of great value to research on the Japanese surrender in the China theater.
中国的战区的受降，不是只在中国的领土上，那中国领土的有一部分也不是归中国管，对不对？东北不是中国管，但是不是中国领土的，比如这个越南，对吧？我们也去受降了。
In the Cairo Conference of 1943, Chiang Kai-shek, as Supreme Allied Commander in the China-Burma-India theater, was already discussing with President Franklin D. Roosevelt the prospect of granting independence to the East Asian colonies then under Japan's control, including Vietnam and Korea. However, later that year, the Southeast Asia Theater was established, with Admiral Louis Mountbatten as Supreme Allied Commander. He gradually took control of the Allies' military operations in Indochina, which would eventually lead to the partition of post-war Vietnam by China and France. Then, in the Potsdam Conference of 1945, where the Allied powers discussed the occupation of Nazi Germany, the three Allied powers made their own decisions on the separation of Indochina surrender zones without the Chinese representative present.
因为欧洲这个美苏冷战已经起来了，整个国际形势来看的话啊，在外交处境上面，中国是没有办法跟这几个国家对抗的。
这个里面就牵涉到一些大国的权益。美国驻华大使赫尔利转来杜鲁门的电报，就提出来，实际上是北纬16度以南地区，把它划到东南亚战区。东南亚战区就是英国的战区，因为这是老大的想法，因为毕竟美国还是老大，中国还要靠美国，这怎么办？所以后来也就同意了。16度以南地区就是说中国就是退出了。
In addition to Vietnam, another place that triggered contentions among the Allies was Hong Kong.
蒋公呢，本来的想法就是说，战后香港应该要回归中国。英国确定的方针是要全面收回香港，重占香港。8月16号，英国大使馆就召会中国外交部，说我们的这个英国的军队正在派兵前往香港。在这种情况下，吴国桢当时外交部次长就提出召会，实际上是提出抗议。
原来应该由广州的这个受降区来负责香港的受降，结果最后英国坚持，而美国妥协， 而且美国妥协之后又给讲压力。
On August 30th, Rear Admiral Cecil Harcourt arrived with a fleet in Hong Kong. The next day, Hong Kong was formally restored as a British colony. After numerous negotiations, finally, under Chiang Kai-shek's authorization, Harcourt accepted Japan's surrender on behalf of the Chinese theater and the British government on September 16th at the Government House. General Pan Huaguo, representing the Republic of China, and representatives of the U.S. and Canada were also present.
从这件事情可以看出来，就是说，在整个战后很多个支配权上面的话，中国有很多个时刻是非常无奈，他必须要配合盟军或者美英的态度而做改变。蒋先生在某一个高点上面的话，他确实做个很多个容忍跟所谓的忍让，也就是要求全。
September 18th, 1945, marked the 14th anniversary of the Mokdan incident. Chiang Kai-shek's diary entry for this day reads, "Alas, although Japan was defeated, our country's turmoil has not ended. In international politics, the strong and powerful prey on the weak. Justice is still an illusion." While the Republic of China had often been forced to sacrifice its interests in international geopolitics, it had achieved remarkable diplomatic status during World War II. On New Year's Day 1942, the Allied Big Four, the US, UK, Soviet Union, and China, signed the declaration by United Nations in Washington, D.C. More significantly, on June 25, 1945, the United States Charter was signed by 50 member countries in San Francisco. These two decisive events had determined the Republic of China's status as a major world power, along with the US, UK, and Soviet Union. Taiwan retrocession was another crucial diplomatic victory for the Republic of China during this period. Starting from the Cairo Declaration on December 1, 1943, the history and fate of Taiwan and Republic of China had begun to intersect.
深く世界の体制と帝国の現状とに鑑み、非常の措置をもって自局を収集せんと欲し、ここに終了なる男児親民に次ぐ清は帝国政府をして米英市と四国に対し、その共同宣言を受諾する旨通告せしめたり。
For most Japanese, this was probably the first time they had heard the voice of their emperor.
職場でもどこでも必ずね、正午になったらラジオの前に集まるようにというやっぱり伝達が来て、で日本の国民はみんなラジオの前に集まった。
全然ラジオの音が悪くてほとんど何言ってるか分かりませんで、負けたんだっていうのが分かったのは2日ぐらいしてから分かりました。
We're together in Tokyo on August 15th when we heard the emperor's announcement that Japan was going to surrender. The feeling of tremendous relief that we no longer had to worry about air raids, that the fighting was over.
放送を聞いてるうちにこれは日本が負けたと思って、でそれを聞いた時に日本の国民は非常にショックだったと思う。
ただそれまで聞いたことのない天皇のその降伏の放送がある。そうすると、天皇自身もこの降伏には、賛成したといいますか、天皇の意思も働いているんだということで納得せざるを得なかった。
This is the 228 Peace Memorial Park in Taipei City. It was called New Park during Japanese colonial rule. In 1934, the Taipei Broadcasting Bureau, a subdivision under the Governor-General of Taiwan, set up this broadcasting station, which served as a free and convenient radio station for nearby residents. At noon on August 15, 1945, many Japanese and local Taiwanese listened to Emperor Hirohito's pre-recorded broadcast as they gathered in front of this very station. Lin Shentong, a member of the gentry class, and tireless advocator for Taiwan's autonomy during Japanese colonial rule, wrote in his diary after listening to the Gyokuon Hoso, "Alas, They built their empire by military prowess for the past 50 years, and now have lost it by military prowess as well.
8月15号投降嘛，前面当然都在观望嘛，谁也不知道发生什么事情，而且广播是不清楚的，有广播的也不过几千副，那要靠口耳相传。
当时候台湾人听到日本战败的这个广播以后，心里是怎么一种反应啊？其实这是一个很复杂。当时候台湾的士绅，像辜振甫这些人，他们呢在日本统治时代有相当高的一个地位，还有这个身家产业。所以当他们一知道日本战败，而且要被国民政府接受的时候，其实他们心情是恐慌的。总督府就来鼓励台湾应该要多跟中国接近，所以呢鼓励台湾人去做欢迎中国到来的一个举动。
Arranged by the Governor General's office, Lin Xiantong, Gu Jianfu, and other Taiwanese intellectuals departed for Shanghai on August 31st, hoping to meet with high officials of the national government to improve mutual understanding. According to Lin's diary, they'd been ordered by the Governor General to attend the surrender ceremony in Nanjing. However, after they arrived in Nanjing on September 8th, they were suddenly informed by General Haruki Isayama, who represented Japanese forces in Taiwan, that they did not need to be present. Therefore, Lin and Gu did not attend. Nevertheless, 2 days later, Lin still had the chance to meet with He Yingqin through the arrangement of Ge Jing'en, and was invited to visit the auditorium where the Nanjing surrender ceremony would take place. Ge Jing'en was Chun's Secretary General and had just been appointed by the national government as chief executive of Taiwan. Chun, who served as Fujian provincial governor before the war broke out, attended the Taiwan Exposition in 1935, his first contact with Taiwan. In 1944, the national government set up the Committee of Investigation in Taiwan and appointed Chun chairman. Outline of the takeover of Taiwan plan that Chun submitted became a blueprint for his rule in Taiwan after World War II. On September 1st, 1945, to conduct the Japanese surrender and takeover in Taiwan, the national government set up the Taiwan Provincial Garrison Command and appointed Chun garrison commander. Under Chun's instruction, on October 5th, Ge Jing'en and the advance command arrived at Taipei and began negotiations with the Governor General on the following day for the forthcoming surrender. The negotiation took place in the Governor General's residence. On this day, the flag of the Republic of China was raised for the first time, symbolizing the beginning of Taiwan's retrocession.
前进指挥所扮演的角色，它是先头部队，它是代表中国战区，也是代表盟军。
10月5号以后，前进指挥所那还有这个美军联络组一起来到台湾，实施的叫做间接统治，也就是说由他们下令，然后要总督府去执行。那么这里面很重要的一件事情，其实就是说，编造，这个所谓的移交清册，所有政府的财产、军队的物资，全部一件不留的，要编造清册作为移交之用。
The American Liaison Group arrived in Taiwan with Ge Jing'en, dispatched by General Albert C. Wedemeyer, commander of U.S. forces in China. The group's mission was to aid in the repatriation of Japanese soldiers, but they were not the first Americans to arrive in Taiwan after World War II. On September 1st, 3 U.S. Rescue Unit members, accompanied by 1 Chinese consultant, arrived from China in Taiwan. Their mission was to make contact with Allied prisoners of war detained by the Japanese Army. On September 5th, led by Japanese vessels, a U.S. fleet sailed into port of Jilong and commenced rescue and evacuation of Allied prisoners. The photos taken by the crew at that time were the earliest images of post-war Taiwan to this day. Meanwhile, to establish initial trust in the Taiwanese people before Chinese troops arrived, the advance command had engaged in intensive propaganda campaigns.
接收之后，这1个多月是不断的透过传播媒体，一个广播，另外一个就是报纸。当时的报紙登了很多怎么接收的怎么举行受降典礼的。
その頃ですね、放送局は面白いことにですね、ある日ある時からね、 中国語になったんですよ。それまで日本語ですよね。それがね、ある日ある時から変わったんですよ。10月になってから、もう日にち覚えてないんですけどね。それまではこちらは台北放送局であります JFAK って言ってたんですよ。で JFBK っていうのもあったの。それは台湾語なんですよ。それからね、ある日ある時からね、なんとかかんとかって言って台北カンパデンタ XUPA って言い出したんですよ。なんだこれはと思ったらその。
On October 17th, the 70th Army arrived near Port of Geelong on U.S. Navy ships and prepared to make a landing. Lin Jingwu, who currently lives in Taipei, was a member of this historic military operation.
上船以前，他就有任务规定，我们到台湾，说不定还要打仗，不是那么太平，大家心里不要慌太松了。到了基隆的时候，一广播了，说敌人没有在基隆防守，我们可以安船登陆，叫大家安心。
In addition to the 70th Army in Geelong, the national government dispatched the 62nd Army, which landed from Kaohsiung in southern Taiwan.
在高雄港、在基隆港都有我们自己国军的司令官在指挥运输，还有美军的海军派驻在2个港口的司令官。
我们这个营指导说要代表70尊，我们就有几百个人嘛，去代表到中山堂那个大门口那一块是我们的，那其他的什么学校啊、什么机关啊，都站在旁边的。
Zhongshan Hall was called Taipei City Public Auditorium during Japanese colonial rule. It was designed to accommodate over 2,000 people. Since its completion in 1936 and well into the post-war period, many large-scale gatherings and activities were held here. At 10 a.m. on October 10, 1945, a grand celebration for Taiwan's retrocession was held here, the first of its kind after the war. The celebration was almost a rehearsal for the Japanese surrender ceremony that would take place 2 weeks later. At 3 p.m. on October 24th, Chunyi arrived at Taipei Songshan Airport from Shanghai. On the morning of October 25th, large crowds assembled outside the public auditorium. Commemorative archways had been erected bearing phrases such as, "In celebration of Taiwan's retrocession," "Japanese surrender ceremony in Taiwan," etc. At either side of the archways, couplets such as, "Reclaim our old territory" and "Build our new Taiwan" could be seen. The mood was ecstatic.
大家只看到一个照片，是在中山堂前面聚集的人群嘛。事实上，大家没有仔细解读那个影像，是在听广播，听里面的受降广播。
到了中山堂以后啊，没有到里面去，我们就到外面，但是他里面讲话我们听得到，他有扩音器。
Guangfu Auditorium on the second floor of Zhongshan Hall was the venue for the surrender ceremony. On the lintel of the entrance, a horizontal inscribed board read, "Signing Hall." A commemorative photograph of Dr. Sun Yat-sen hung high from the ceiling in the auditorium center. Flags of the Allied victors were raised, together with the Chinese characters, He Ping Yong Dian, "May peace last forever." The decorations were almost the same as the Nanjing surrender ceremony. The enormous V displayed behind the seats of the Chinese delegation was especially eye-catching. After the guests had arrived, the ceremony finally commenced at 10 a.m. Under the witness of international guests, and as decreed by the Chinese Army headquarters, Chunyi instructed Rikichi Ando, the Japanese representative, to sign the certificate of receiving order. The certificate was then handed back to Chun by the Chief of Staff, Haruki Isayama. At 10:05, the signing procedure concluded. Chunyi announced through an island-wide broadcast that the Japanese forces in Taiwan had surrendered, and that from this day on, Taiwan and Penghu were officially under the governance of the Republic of China. After the ceremony, photos of Chunni and other Chinese army officers were taken. At the end of that year, the public auditorium was renamed Zhongshan Hall. On October 18, 1946, Taiwan Provincial Executive Office proclaimed October 25th Taiwan's Retrocession Day, a publicly observed holiday. On the 21st, Chiang Kai-shek and his wife arrived in Taiwan for their first inspection. On the 25th, the couple attended the anniversary of Taiwan's retrocession ceremony in Zhongshan Hall. Jiang's diary entry on that day reads, "Throngs of civilians and students lined up along the roads from Zhongshan Bridge all the way to the Zhongshan Hall Square for more than 10 miles. Their cheers and exultation has moved me tremendously." Today, Retrocession Day is no longer an official holiday. While the government still holds an annual commemoration, its meaning seems to have faded from people's memory. However, the fervent hope for everlasting peace that was felt so strongly in every surrender ceremony held in the post-war China theater has yet to be realized in this part of East Asia.
当时不管是东方的日本，或者是西方的纳粹，其实他们都是侵略成性的国家，他们不断的对外发动的战争，所以它是一场不公义的战争。那所幸这个盟国最后赢得了这场胜利。
I think just shows you how some fanatical, totally illogical minds can determine the destiny of a nation. And I think one lesson from that is that we should really study that very irrational series of decisions to ensure that that will never happen again. I mean, one would hope that that will not happen to Japan, but we have to hope that the same thing will not happen to other countries also.
过个70年之后，更应该去反思另外一个问题，就是到底战争有没有必要性？不管是侵略的日本，或者被侵略的中国，都付出个非常严重的一些所谓的代价。
世界中の国が自分たちのね、やっぱりね、軍隊をね、戦争を放棄すればね、世界は平和になりますよ。
I think there is an awareness that we have to share memory, share the past. Without that, without some kind of shared memory, there can be no regional understanding, no peace. So that's why we have to get to that.
On the afternoon of May 25, 2015, the American National Memorial Day Parade took place in Washington, D.C. This year marked the 70th anniversary of victory in World War II. In the parade, the Republic of China was specifically introduced to participants as a member of the Allied forces during the war. The Republic of China flag was raised proudly on foreign territory, the image seen throughout the world. 70 years ago, on the East Asian battlefields, over 3 million Chinese army soldiers were killed or wounded. More than 20 million civilians suffered death or injuries. Almost half of our territory was invaded and taken by the enemy. 100 million people were displaced because of the war, and it's impossible to measure the losses. Lloyd E. Eastman, an American historian, said, "The resistance of Chinese army soldiers is a miracle of determination and self-supporting. If there had been no civil wars after 1945, historians would have written a heroic poem on the Chinese army's resistance against Japan." From the standpoint of world history, China's war of resistance against Japan was not just the key to the Allies' ultimate victory in the East in World War II, but an inspiring history of perseverance, struggle, and determination. With the release of wartime documents, scholars in the West and Communist China have gradually discarded prejudice and ideologies and acknowledged the historical fact that the national government led China to victory in the war of resistance. As citizens of the Republic of China, we should remember that victory and peace were not easily won, that this shared past is a history written in tears and blood, and that our forefathers created this history with their sacrifices.